Andy likes to do these dumpster dives through the depths of Rumble, where he finds stuff like this, and he found a video of somebody arguing that any sort of redistribution of wealth at all, right, should be a problem on Christian grounds. Do we have that?
I am going to go with the working assumption that at least the moral law in the Old Testament has binding power on the conscience of the believer. And the most basic form of the moral law of the Old Testament are the Ten Commandments. The Eighth Commandment says, "You shall not steal." You can find the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. It's really simple. And it doesn't leave any wiggle room to say it's okay in certain circumstances. The simple point here is, I cannot enter my neighbor's house. Let's say my neighbor has a TV in every bedroom and he has 4 bedrooms. I can't enter my neighbor's house and steal one of his TVs and take it down the road to the person who's poor, who doesn't have a TV at all. I don't know a single Christian who would deem such behavior to be okay. It's plain and simple to see that this is stealing. Essentially, what the state does is take from you and give to somebody else. If you think about it quietly, the state takes from one person, from a group of people. Well, actually, it takes from everybody, but it takes from people to varying different degrees. It takes from some and gives to others. The motives behind the state taking and giving to the poor might be benevolent. I'm not questioning that at this moment. But it is also undeniable that my motive behind taking the TV from my neighbor and giving it to the poor person could just as well be benevolent. The issue here is not one of motive. The issue here is one of principle. The advocate of socialism has to deal with the problem of theft by the state. I have so far never heard a reasonable argument that sufficiently deals with this problem in relation to the biblical command, "You shall not steal."
Yeah, so there you have it. He's never heard a sufficient argument that I guess you can be a Christian without being a deontic libertarian.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing that we learned in Bible camp very early on, right? You read the Bible and then you read Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and that's all you really needed.
Yes, I've run into people like this in the past, these Catholic libertarians, and I have a number of ways of responding to that. I would go back to the very beginning and talk about how the Old Testament, which he referred to, treats private property. It says very clearly that private property is not absolute. In fact, if you look at the Jubilee not only forgives debts, but the Jubilee says all land sales that have taken place over the past 50 years have to revert to their original owner, because private property is not absolute. So, of course, this kind of Christian principle was taken up by the church fathers. It was taken up in a very sophisticated manner by Thomas Aquinas, who distinguished between private ownership and common use. He basically said that private ownership of property is valid, but, and here's the big but, it has to be in the service of common use. In other words, everybody has to be able to use those resources. So the terms that Pope Francis would use, he would say private property is not a primary natural right, it's a secondary natural right. Pope John Paul II says private property comes always with a social mortgage. This is called the principle of the universal destination of goods, the idea that the goods of the earth and human labor are destined for all people, every single person in the world. And if private property is not oriented towards the universal destination, then it's not valid. And that's a very consistent principle in Christianity. It's kind of radical, but it's basically there. And what it does is, and Aquinas was very clear about this, it basically gives the poor rights against the rich.
Yeah, Matt, is there anything you want to throw in here?
Oh, I was just waiting for you to say something. No, I agree with a lot of what Tony said there, right? I mean, the simplest way to rebut that is by saying that if the state takes something from someone because it declares that it's no longer their property, then from a legal standpoint, it no longer is their property. Now, from any good Christian perspective, we could ask ourselves whether this positive reformulation of the law or this positive articulation of the law is in fact just, and whether or not it serves the common good. And if it's not just and it doesn't serve the common good, then obviously it can be rejected or even resisted in some circumstances. But this kind of deontic supposition that private property exists outside the state and is only interfered with by the state has really no basis in biblical scripture, and of course no basis in history whatsoever. It's really very much the only thing it's really very much the kind of thing that only a libertarian could dream up. This kind of ahistorical, bizarre world where property pre-exists the law and yet somehow needs to be consecrated through the law and backed up by force. And it really should be rejected as the absurdity that it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have a couple of ways you could go here. So one is basically what you just said, which is the sort of, the Brunigish objection to this, which is to say, well, look, if you say you can't take somebody's property, then the all of the question is, what do you mean by that, right? Like what constitutes their property, and if it's legally what if you're talking about what's legally somebody's property, then this kind of doesn't work as an objection to any sort of redistribution that happens through the state, because then anything that's taxed or nationalized through an act of government is no longer legally your property. And again, I would point out that there's something especially strange about taxation as theft from a Christian perspective, given that one of the few very clear political teachings of the New Testament is that you should pay your taxes. That's to pay for legions to occupy your country. Never mind, for like a welfare state that could benefit. But then if you say, well, okay, but I don't mean legally, I mean what's morally you have a right to, then that just pushes the question back, right? Because it's like, okay, well, what's your substantive moral theory of entitlement to property? And that's very not obvious. I mean, you can have a sort of lock-in view that anything you've mixed your liquor with, you therefore have eternal property rights to, but or part with by a process of Nozick's capitalistic acts between consenting adults. But it does seem like a bit much to read Locke and Nozick into the Bible, especially given the clear endorsement of taxation, especially given Tony mentioned the Jubilee and periodic enforced redistributions there. I've been reading this book, the David Lee Williams, The Greatest of All Plagues.
I just finished that. It's really good.
Yeah, it is very good. I'm on, should the editor who commissioned the review be watching this, I'm like 10 pages from the end right now.
You're not shirking your duties there, Ben. It's like, you should be reading that, but instead you're here chatting with us.
Yeah, exactly. But he makes in the New Testament chapter of that, he makes great hay of this, this point about the Jubilee, so which again suggests certainly something well short of absolutist libertarian property rights. But then again, there's also a question of, well, okay, if you have in mind some sort of substantive, not merely legal theory of entitlement to property, then now what we're talking about is who is morally entitled to what property, which one makes the theft objection circular, because now you're essentially saying that it's wrong to redistribute wealth because the people you're redistributing from have a right to it, which seems like the same thing said twice with because in the middle. And two, if you,
what's that line in the Wizard of Oz? Like because like Robert Nozick says it does, that kind of thing,
Yeah, right. And like if you are assuming a substantive theory of moral entitlement to property, and we're not just reading John Locke back into the Bible, then it seems reasonable to think that what counts as a morally justifiable scheme for distribution of property has something to do with the ability of everybody to live a flourishing life, which is presumably, I know much less, certainly about this than Tony does, but I mean, presumably is something like what's in the background of that Pope Francis line about, thinking of property as a secondary, a natural right rather than a sort of first order one.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to say to that is, I think that there are a lot of different views on the right way to understand property within the Christian tradition, obviously, right? Some of which have more libertarian connotations than others. But I think it's worth asking yourself how a kind of left Christian would understand property and the proper distribution of property. So I'll just kind of run through a few different figures that I think are significant in this respect.
Yeah, please.
I guess I'll go from older to newer. How about that, right? Just to kind of cite my 3 articles, because people can already look them up when they want. Let's take Paul Tillich, for example, right? Tony probably has a few problems with Tillich's Protestantism and existentialism from a theological standpoint. No problem with that. But what I'd recommend that people read is his really fantastic book, The Socialist Decision. So The Socialist Decision was written as a polemic against Nazism. Tillich himself was kind of a bohemian theologian influenced by people like Schelling and Heidegger, living in Berlin during the Weimar Republic. And he was deeply disturbed, of course, by the rise of fascism and this kind of blood and soil anti-theology, if you want to call it that, right? That kind of emphasized the crudest forms of human supremacism over what he considered to be issues of much higher concern. And in The Socialist Decision, he makes it very clear that socialism is a modernist doctrine that is an advance in many senses on liberalism, but continuous with it. You can understand why I like Tillich, right? I almost included in my book. But in terms of the kind of property relations that he argues for, he says, look, it's very obvious that God gave the world to human beings in common, and it was intended by God that the earth should work to the benefit of all human beings, not the Volk, certainly, or individual capitalists. And the right way, and this is a very Protestant attitude, to go about distributing property is in a rational way that will be conducive to the benefit of all people without individual egoistic interest interfering with the kind of calculations and evaluations about the best way to basically supply those kinds of flourishing. Now, he doesn't really go into an enormous amount of detail about this in terms of the technical arguments for how to redistribute wealth, because he's a theologian, not an economist or a policymaker. But I think his grounding of this idea in a rationalistic, existential Christian theology, not things that always go well together, but I think Tillich makes it work. And its juxtaposition against these kinds of individualistic chauvinism and nationalist chauvinism is very powerful stuff, because it reminds us of the universality of the human condition and the fact that all human beings share a lot of needs in common, whether it's for food or water or housing or play or friendship, and of course, access to what's of ultimate concern spiritually. And a good society is one that tries to provide that for as many people as possible. So that's Tillich for you. I'll just pause and ask if Tony wants to say anything, and then I can move on to talking a bit about Taylor and MacIntyre if people are interested. Oh, Tony is gone. Ben, you're muted.
All right, we got Tony again.
I don't know what happened there. I just disappeared for a minute. It knocked me out. Yeah.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
Halloween.
Okay,
Satan's interfering with us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. It's the libertarians. Yeah.
there you go. So yeah, is there anything you wanted to come in on with what Matt just said about Tillich?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I'm not, to be totally honest, I'm not that familiar with Tillich and his theology. So I'll go back to Matt on that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, if people are interested, his main work in theology is a big 3-volume set, Christian systematic theology. It's pretty controversial in part because it almost makes a kind of Spinozist argument about the existence of God, right? Suggesting that God can be understood in many different symbolic ways. Christianity, as Tillich thinks, the most appropriate symbolic way of understanding God, but not necessarily the only one. So kind of Spinozist Hegelian in that vein. And some people really like this, other people don't. I tend to think that there's a lot of value to it. But in terms of thinkers that I've talked about more contemporaneously, I'm really attracted to the thinking of people like Charles Taylor and Alasdair MacIntyre, who are broadly speaking usually labeled communitarians, people who argue against atomistic forms of liberal individualism, arguing that a society that's committed to atomistic forms of liberal individualism is one where a lot of people's social needs aren't going to be fulfilled. That includes their economic needs, of course, because of the effects of capitalism, but also includes our need for things like community, right? Non-competitive social relations that are absolutely vital in forming non-alienated relationships with others, friendship, romantic relations, even joining things like hockey clubs, you know what I mean? Or hockey teams, or bowling leagues or whatever it happens to be. Now, Taylor's argument is that we need to understand the dissolution of contemporary community along a number of different ways. One of the reasons why contemporary communities, he thinks, have corroded to the extent they have right now is because of the influence of capitalism and the kind of egoistic individualism that he associates with that. But he also thinks that a complicating factor is the decline of solidaristic religious beliefs. So he points out that in the kind of antiquarian world and through the Middle Ages, most people, the main form of community that they were able to enjoy was, of course, going to things like church, being part of religious organizations and feeling they're part of something bigger than that. Now, if you were to read him just this way, you might think, oh, this is clearly going in a kind of quasi-reactionary but slightly anti-capitalist direction. But what I really like about Taylor is he never goes there. He actually says, look, the reality is that modern ethics are clearly superior to the ethics of pre-modernity. This is a point he makes in Modern Social Imaginaries. There's just a price that you pay for moving towards a modern ethics. So modern ethics is superior to older ethical forms because modern ethics tends to be anti-hierarchical and emphasize that it's as important that somebody in Argentina's life goes well as that my life here in the United States or Canada goes well, which is not the kind of attitude antiquarian thinkers would emphasize. It's this emphasis on my people need to be looked after, and then maybe your people can get a little bit of my sympathy, but not too much, right? Now, the price paid for this, according to Taylor, this kind of universalistic attitude, is actually a feeling of alienation, because since our ethical standards have become so universal and so high that oftentimes we feel that our societies aren't living up to them. And when you accompany that with the feelings of alienation that are induced by things like capitalism, people can feel that the societies they live in are profoundly disappointing in a lot of respects. They're immoral. They're not living up to their own standards. People are hyper-competitive, not communal. But his argument is that rather than abandoning a commitment to modernity and embracing return as it was, instead we need to make good the promise of modernity. And he thinks that that's in keeping with the spirit of Christianity and his commitment to things like the dignity of all people, the equality of all in the eyes of God, and the recognition that we share a human nature that warrants expression if we're able to establish the kind of societies that enable our full flourishing. Now, MacIntyre, who is probably the most controversial thinker that I talk about there, is a really complicated guy. And actually, if Tony wants to say anything, then if Tony wants to chime in, I'll save that discussion until afterwards, because that'll take me a while.
Sure. Well, I have a complicated relationship with MacIntyre. I used to be a big fan of his, and I still admire a lot of his thought, especially his communitarian outlook, his diagnosis of emotivism being the main driver of modern ethics. I think there's a lot of validity to that. But where I fundamentally disagree with MacIntyre is on the idea of universal human rights. MacIntyre thinks that they don't exist. He says they're like witches and unicorns. They don't exist. And I think that's just fundamentally wrong. And I think I actually have modern Catholic social teaching on my side on that, because modern Catholic social teaching is very much in favor of universal human rights. I guess it's not too surprising given that Catholic means universal. So yeah, that goes there. So I guess you'd see the kind of the MacIntyrean influence in Catholic social teaching through this principle called integral human development, which is really about the fullest development of the development of the whole person and all people. So it's really the fullest development of a person's capabilities and capacities. So it's a very Aristotelian notion. So it's not just about the material dimension. It's not just about money or goods or wealth. It's about being who you're supposed to be if you develop your capacities. And that's very MacIntyrean. So I think there's a very clear overlap there. That principle, by the way, goes back to Pope Paul VI from 1967. So before MacIntyre was writing After Virtue, I think this was being developed in Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, just to your point about human rights, I'd like to point out that one of the chief drafters and chief intellectual influences on the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was the Catholic thinker Jacques Maritain, right? Well, I always remember from my human rights class because apparently when he was dialoguing with people of different religious faiths and they came up with the draft of the UDHR, he was asked, well, what do you have to say about this? And he was like, all of us agree on the rights that need to be in here, as long as nobody asks why. The kind of reference being, don't ask whether it's grounded in Islam or Judaism or Christianity. Right. We've got a consensus on these things, kind of a Rawlsian overlapping consensus, right? That's enough.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.